For a long, long time, all over the world, people have been telling stories, and lots of those stories are about God. We tell stories for many reasons, because they are funny, sad, exciting, scary, or happy. We tell stories because they help us explore and share our feelings, and who and what is important to us. Our most special stories can become sacred stories. Sacred stories can be told for hundreds and thousands of years, over and over. Today, we will explore an old sacred story and wonder about why our ancestors chose to tell this story and why it was important to them. Then we will discover a newer story that may help us understand something important and sacred in a new way. Thank you for hanging out with me and exploring special sacred story time. Welcome to Heart Stories. God is a promise. Because of this, we can be sure that life is stronger than death, that love is stronger than hate. Because of God, we can believe that goodness will one day fill the earth and that there will no longer be any wickedness, because God has promised this. And we can help make this promise come true, a little each day. Today, our ancient story is from Acts 9 and 1 Corinthians. Our story talks about Paul. Paul is a famous person in our Bible stories, and he wrote lots of the letters in the Bible. Today, we're learning about how Paul became a Christian. The temple leaders were jealous of all the people following Jesus. They had many put in jail. Some were even killed. The believers were especially afraid of one man. His name was Saul. One day, Saul was on his way to arrest Jesus' followers in Damascus. Suddenly, he fell to the ground, blinded by a brilliant light. He heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you attacking me?" It was Jesus speaking to him. For 3 days, Paul was blind and did not eat or drink. On the 4th day, he had a change of heart. Now he believed in Jesus. Saul was baptized. He changed his name to Paul. He wrote many letters to encourage the new churches in faraway lands. Many people asked Paul questions, including what was most important to God. Paul answered, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. But what is love? They asked. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not feel jealous of other people or brag. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It rejoices not in wrongdoing, but in truth and justice and forgiveness. Let's say a little prayer. Dear God, please give me faith, hope, and love. Our story today is called Sidney and Norman, A Tale of Two Pigs. It's written by Paul Fisher and illustrated by Justin Gerard. It's published by Tommy Nelson and Jellyfish Press. On a quiet street in a quiet town lived two pigs. They didn't oink or eat slop. No, this isn't that kind of story. They wore suit coats and went to work. And even though they lived right next door to each other, they didn't know each other's names. The pig on the right was Norman. He was a very good pig. Rules and hard work had always come easily to him, and it showed. His house was neat and organized. He always looked his very best. He gave money to the needy and never missed church on Sunday. Norm's teachers liked him when he was young, and his boss at work liked him now that he was all grown up. He was pretty sure God liked him too. After all, he was a very good pig. Norman figured that everyone could be as good as he was if they'd just try a little harder. He wondered why they didn't. The pig on the left was Sidney. Things didn't come quite as easily for Sidney. Rules and systems and schedules seemed, well, a bit slippery. One minute he thought he had them, and the next minute, whoops, where did they go? He was forever running 10 minutes late and could never manage, no matter how hard he tried, to get his tie perfectly straight. Not like his neighbor. What was his name? Sidney got into trouble in school, which frustrated his teachers. He got in trouble at work, which frustrated his boss. He knew God was watching and figured God was pretty frustrated too. But most of all, Sidney frustrated Sidney. Why was everything so hard? Why couldn't he be more like, what was his name? Sidney felt broken. And some days, that made it hard to get up in the morning. Some days, in fact, Sidney couldn't get up at all. Since Sidney was usually late, and Norman was usually early, they very seldom saw each other. Unless, that is, they happened to fetch their mail at the same time, which is exactly what happened one bright morning in October. Now, normally if Sidney saw Norman, he would look down and shuffle back inside. He was sure Norman was staring at his tie or his hair or the papers half stuck into his briefcase. He was sure Norman was looking down on him for being messy, which, for the most part, was absolutely correct. But this day, Norman didn't look at Sidney's tie, and Sidney didn't look away, because they were both staring at the small, pale blue envelopes they had received in the mail. One was addressed to Norman, and the other to Sidney. Had someone invited them both to the same party? Eager to unravel the mystery, the two pigs opened the envelopes. Norman read, "Dear Norman," and Sidney read, "Dear Sidney," followed by, "I would like you to come visit me at 77 Elm Street next Tuesday, at your convenience. I have something to tell you." They both glanced at the bottom of the page and read, "Sincerely, God." Sidney and Norman reread the invitation several times to make sure they had read them correctly. God wanted to talk to them? On Tuesday? On Elm Street? Sidney panicked. Deep in his heart was a familiar feeling. The feeling he had when, as a young pig, his teacher sent him to the principal's office. Terror, panic, doom. Norman smiled. He too felt a familiar feeling. The feeling he had when, as a young pig, he was called up in front of the school to receive an award. Anticipation, happiness, pride. Sidney taped the invitation inside the front of his door so he wouldn't lose it. Norman entered the date neatly in his date book. Both pigs had trouble sleeping that night for very different reasons. Tuesday came. Norman awoke early, dressed, and headed down the street with the pale blue envelope firmly in hand. Just waking up, Sidney saw him pass by the window and rushed for the shower. Norman walked tall and proud. Others on the street noticed he looked a bit taller and more than a little puffier than usual that morning. His hair was neat and his tie extraordinarily straight, much straighter than anyone else's on the street. God would certainly be pleased. Norman found the address and went inside, greeting the woman at the front desk with his important voice. She directed him down a long hall, through a heavy wooden door, and into a large room, where he found God sitting behind an immense desk. The sight made Norman nervous. But then he thought, what did he have to be nervous about? He was a good pig. God walked around the desk and smiled at the puffed-up pig. "I'm glad you could make it," God said warmly. "I have a few things to tell you." "First of all," God began, "I love you." Norman smiled, though he wasn't surprised. "Secondly, your goodness is not the reason I love you." Norman startled a little. What a curious thing for God to say. "Thirdly," God continued, "you're not as good as you have led yourself to believe. You're prideful. You're selfish. You look down on others simply because things don't come as easily for them." God looked a little sad now. "I love them just as much as I love you. Don't look down on those I love." Then God smiled and returned to the desk. "That's what I needed to tell you." Norman swallowed hard. That was the award? That was the commendation? Confused, he turned and ran down the hall, past the front desk, and back out onto the street. His head was spinning. He felt dizzy. Was God finding fault with him? He was a good pig. He noticed his tie was off kilter and hurried to straighten it. Not perfect, but at least it was better than that fellow over there in the yellow jacket, or the guy in the blue, or any of these people for that matter. Then it hit him. He was looking down on those people. Right then. Right there. Just like God had said. And he'd done it yesterday. And the day before. 20 times a day at least. Norman's face grew hot. God was right. He was selfish. He was prideful. For the first time in his life, the good pig had to face the fact that he had been very, very bad. His pride in his goodness was his sin. He buried his face in his hands and hurried home, tears splashing on his neat gray suit. From his window, Sidney saw his neighbor return and froze in shock. Was he crying? Sidney couldn't breathe. Oh dear, oh dear. If that's what a visit to God did to that guy, oh, he was doomed. Hands shaking, Sidney tried one more time to get his tie to lie just right. Why was it so hard? Now where was his hat? Not on the hook, of course. Oh, under the couch. Hat in hand, he peeled the pale blue envelope off the door and stepped outside. A bird was singing that morning, but Sidney didn't hear it. The sun was shining brightly, but Sidney didn't see it. Doomed, he thought. Doomed. Sidney trudged down the sidewalk and suddenly was back in school. A little pig headed down the long hall toward the principal's office. Hands sweating, hearts racing, doomed. God will see right through me, Sidney thought as he turned onto Elm Street. My messes, my mistakes, everything. And then he was there. Though he had walked as slowly as he could, he was there. Sidney stepped inside. He tried to say something to the woman at the front desk, but found he couldn't speak. She smiled and motioned him to a heavy wooden door down the hall. He gulped. A few moments later, he stood before the door. He wanted to run away. He wanted to hide. But there was no place to go, and nothing to hide behind. So, hat in hand, he pushed open the door and slipped inside. And there, beside the desk, was God. Sidney gulped again. I'm glad you could come, God said, smiling. Sidney tried to respond, but couldn't make a noise. I want to tell you something, God continued, and came around the desk. Sidney glanced around nervously. Maybe if he apologized. First of all, God began, I love you. Sidney startled, surprised. Secondly, God continued, in a quieter voice, I love you. Sidney was gripping his hat a little less tightly now. And thirdly, God paused, very close to Sidney. I love you. The look in God's eyes warmed Sidney right down to his toes. That is what I wanted to tell you, God said, and stepped back toward the desk, still smiling. Sidney stood frozen for a moment. Then, realizing God had finished, he turned and ran quickly from the room. I don't understand, he said aloud when he reached the street. Didn't God see me? Didn't God see who I am? It didn't make sense. Then it occurred to Sidney. I did it. I fooled God. Sidney looked at the others on the street, smiling. Yes, that must be it. I looked good when it was most important, and God bought it. Just then, Sidney caught his reflection in a store window. His hair was rumpled, his tie off-kilter, as usual. And he spotted a large toothpaste stain. His smile vanished. That couldn't be it. He couldn't have fooled anybody, not looking like that. Sidney was confused. There was only one other possibility. That God just loved him. Exactly like he was. Messes and all. Sidney felt the warmth he had seen in God's eyes, welling up inside him again. Others on the street would later talk about the small, messy pig they saw that day that appeared to be, well, glowing. All the way home, Sidney looked for words to tell everyone what he was feeling. But all he found were tears. Happy tears. Lots of them. The next day, two pigs emerged from their homes on a bright, crisp October morning and looked at each other. The pig on the left, named Sidney, who seemed a bit taller than before, looked at his neighbor's neat, straight tie and clean clothes, and smiled. The pig on the right, named Norman, who seemed ever so slightly less puffy, looked at his neighbor's crooked tie and rumpled hair, and smiled. It was a real smile, too. The kind that comes from deep inside. The kind he hadn't smiled in a long, long time. Sidney and Norman became good friends. There were still mornings now and then when Norman would wake up feeling a little puffy. But all he had to do was remember what he had learned at 77 Elm Street. Then the puffiness would quickly vanish, and his real smile would return. And as for Sidney, he still has his share of messes, though not as many as before. And there were still a few days when he wasn't quite sure he could get up in the morning. But if you stood outside his window on one of those days, this is what you'd hear. First of all, God loves me. Secondly, God loves me. And thirdly, God loves me. And that was all it took. Today, the neighbor pigs in our story have different personalities. When it starts out, Norman thinks he's the best pig and he's doing great. But he realizes that he's not doing that great, that he should be more loving and kind. And Sidney realizes that even though he's not perfect and he makes a mess sometimes, that he's still as good as everyone else and that God loves us all the same. In our Bible story today, when it started, Saul thought he was doing what was right. But really, he was being mean and he was hurting other people. But he realized that there was a better way, and he changed. Just like Norman. Just like Sidney. We all have things that we can improve on, but God loves us all, and we should keep doing better. See you next week.
Everyone, everywhere in the world, and all throughout time, in the ancient past and in the faraway future, has a heartbeat, just like you. All people love and live and feel. All people tell stories to make sense of it all. Let's keep telling stories to honor the past and help create the future. I'll see you next time for more heart stories.
You can purchase the wonderful books used in today's Heart Stories by visiting your local bookseller or using the links in the description below.